My name is Aubrey Turner. I'm a Director of Client Solutions at Optiv. And this morning, I'm going to talk to you about, hey, the walls have come down, but are you ready? But before I get started, I'm just curious how many might be feeling like I'm feeling right now. And who was out past 8 o'clock last night? Past 9 o'clock? 10 o'clock? 11? Midnight? 1. All right. I'll claim it and own it. So anyway, so like I said, okay. So the walls have come down, but are you ready? So I'd like to start with a brief history around, gosh, this thing keeps, sorry guys. Oh, okay. So yeah, just a brief history of maybe some famous walls that have come down and people weren't quite ready for it. Does anybody here remember what the Maginot Line is? Oh, awesome. So we got some historians in the room. For those of you that maybe don't recall, the Maginot Line was built by former French Prime Minister, I think his name is Andre Maginot, and it was a fortification, it was a wall between France and Germany. And it was meant to protect French from invasion. This keeps doing this, sorry. And so it was meant to protect the French from invasion by the Germans. And essentially it failed, right? The French failed to account for a part of the wall on the French-Belgian border, and they were not prepared. So essentially the Germans, through blitzkrieg and some other things, identified some weak spots in that wall, in that fortification, and were able to overcome and overwhelm the French, who were not ready. So that wall came down. Sometime later, those of us that pay attention to history, the Berlin Wall also came down. And what I understand and read about that period of time between East and West Germany, they weren't exactly ready for when that wall came down either. So my job here is to sort of prepare you for, or at least advise you and give you some thoughts about, hey, these walls are coming down, how do we prepare for it, how do we get ready for it, and avoid some of the historical lessons that I just kind of talked about. So, and these walls that I'm talking about in relation to identity are, the perimeter techniques, the perimeter defenses that we've invested hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in trying to protect our data and our networks. Still led to breaches. And then some of the internal walls within our organization that prevent us from securing our systems in a more meaningful way so that we avoid breaches. We spend a lot of time in our personal and professional lives tearing down walls to get things done. So that aspect of this conversation related to those walls is also critical. It's not just the logical network, physical gear, it's those professional walls that we also need to be prepared when those walls come down, because a lot of times we attack those walls, we try to tear them down. When they come down, we're not ready. So we know that breaches have continued to accelerate. Is there anyone here who has never been impacted by a breach? Raise your hand. Right, okay, so that the point is made that we continue to see a lot of breaches. The breach data tells us that, at the end of the day, these breaches are the result of some kind of compromised identity. And, excuse me for 1 second. Sorry, this clicker is very, I don't know if it's me or if the clicker is temperamental, but anyway, we'll try to work with that because it keeps doing that. I don't know what's going on with it. All right, I'm going to, and now that happened. Hold on a second. Is this? Yeah, that might be better. Oh. Okay, let's do that. Okay, so picking up where I left off, just again, we know breaches are accelerating. Again, the breach data, essentially 100% of the data out there tells us that breaches are a result of stolen or compromised credentials. And that just really relates to weak or compromised identity practices. Can you go to the next one? All right. So today's problem, attackers want identity. Again, I mentioned the ineffective controls. And again, in a vast oversimplification of how a breach occurs, right? A account is compromised. It is used to elevate privileges. And of course, we have data exfiltration. And I know that's an oversimplification, but that's really the core of today's problem. And this is the same situation that, again, in a maybe a stretch of an analogy that the French faced with this Maginot Line. They failed to account for a weakness in that line on the Belgian part of the border. So an ineffective part of the fortification, exactly. So next one. And so you guys are familiar with Kevin Mitnick, I'm sure, if you've been in cybersecurity for some time. But the point here is that we can spend hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, billions of dollars on encryption, firewalls, and all kinds of security technologies. But if an attacker compromises a trusted person and they comply, all that money, all that technology is essentially wasted. And so that illustrates, again, that point that we can certainly, again, spend and overspend in some cases, and still have a weakness that is easily compromised and leads to data exfiltration. So where are we spending money on security today? About $6.2 billion on identity, and you can kind of see there that a lot more is being spent on, not that these areas aren't necessary or not required, but a lot more is being spent on vulnerability management, endpoint protection, and network security. And again, going back a couple slides, we know that those investments are certainly required, but again, if you can get an identity, what you spent here is essentially not very effective and not money well invested. Yeah, why we're not spending? A number of reasons, right? Perception, identity is difficult. And also and this is part of where I see the walls, again, those personal and professional walls that I talked about, not the network and logical and physical technology walls, but distributor to no ownership leads to confusion. So what that means is the distribution of IAM, in some cases security, leads to confusion. And in my experience, as of late, the walls in that particular area, I think somewhat led by privileged access management, has come down somewhat. And these teams are working together somewhat. But that's not the end, right? That's just a part of the story, a part of being prepared for when these walls do come down further, that, again, teams can collaborate. And like anything else, right, there are consequences for our action or lack of action. And we know that if you don't manage identity well on-prem, you're not going to do it well in the cloud. And so that's often overlooked and an afterthought, and we know that there's some consequences due to that lack of focus. Certainly, more identities to manage across more environments increases our exposure, and certainly we've got all kinds of audit findings and things like that So we've got ineffective support for the things that we're trying to do from a compliance perspective. And we know that IAM spans every initiative. It could be ingrained in literally all the other cybersecurity domains that you're dealing with, from mobility to threat intelligence to security awareness. All of these areas certainly have some context or can have some context or leverage some identity contextually to help make security much better. And we know, right, that you as practitioners and cybersecurity experts, this is the landscape of technology that you are dealing with. And so as you're looking for solutions across these various areas, and I touched on the investments, the billions of dollars in investments that we've made, that this is the landscape. And a colleague of mine actually has one that is even sort of more verbose than this, has even more vendors, which really, this is already an eye chart, but you could imagine with 2,000-3,000 vendors how this might look. So we're dealing with a landscape of a lot of vendors, a lot of shiny objects. Any of you attend RSA, those kind of conferences, you know that there's a lot of vendors. But the good news is a lot of them have some context of identity now, and that's, I think, helping with, again, bringing those walls down. And so we need to evolve. Identity needs to evolve, right? We've all heard this identity as the new perimeter. And in that analogy I gave of the Maginot Line, this fortress, and by the way, this line was very elaborate. It had living quarters, it was air conditioned. I mean, this is something built in the 30s. It was air conditioned, it had munitions, it was very elaborately planned. And so when we talk about identity as a perimeter, it's this fortified boundary that protects the troop position, and that's what the Maginot Line was. Yet it still had a weakness that was exploited relatively easily by the Germans. And so the idea is here that identity needs to evolve in order to support cybersecurity programs in more depth, right? We need to get past the perimeter. Identity needs to become more ubiquitous, right? And if the French had understood their relationship with the Belgian part of their border, they may have had a better chance and be better prepared for when that line, the Maginot Line, eventually fell. So that line of thinking, identity needs to evolve, needs to become more ubiquitous. And really become the language of identity, becoming the language of security, right? We need to look at our cybersecurity programs through the lens of identity. And that's part of being ready as these perimeter walls come down, as again, these interdepartmental walls that we have at our companies, as those walls come down and more teams begin to talk, again, we need to look at our cybersecurity program through the lens of identity and understand that identity is rapidly becoming, if not already, the language of security. And so with that, we have the notion of identity-defined security, nothing that you guys probably already haven't heard of, but this is the future, and this is what we need to build towards. This is what we should be motivated towards understanding. And again, to mitigate breach and mitigate all those bad things, we need to evolve. And this is sort of the blueprint for what model we should evolve to. And this is on the Identity-Defined Security Alliance website, the blueprint along with use cases for those of you that elected to take a couple pictures. But again, this is the high-level integration with identity at the core and a lot of other, if you go back to that slide with all those vendors on it, this is how it ties together. So keeping with that military theme and the whole, Maginot Line idea, what's our battle plan? How do we get started, right? How do I, convince you to move forward and as you leave here and continue for the rest of the conference and go back to your day jobs, what should you be thinking about, and how do you prepare as these walls come down? How do you get ready? What do you need to do? So certainly having a strategic investment and programmatic approach to identity, that's absolutely critical. Starting with the basics, access control, risk-based strong authentication, those kind of things. Certainly I mentioned privileged access management I see it as a bridge between different groups who, at one point PAM projects were run in isolation, maybe by an infrastructure team or some other team that realized they had a need, not necessarily in conjunction with the security team. We see that those teams working a lot more closely, so those walls have come down. But starting with the basics around access control and access governance, building an identity warehouse, understanding who has access, more to come on that in a second, and certainly solving, if you're loosely managing privileged identities, getting that under control through some kind of plan. And so before you do anything, assume you've been breached and the attackers still have access. Adopt a zero defect model, and I'll explain what I mean by that in the next slide. And then secure those identities. I talked about PAM just a second ago. Secure those identities that would allow lateral movement, those OEM accounts, age accounts, privilege accounts, all that kind of stuff. So those are some of the high-level things that you should do to be ready. And I talked about applying or leveraging a zero defect model. And so what this means is I am 100% certain we know every single person that works for us, right, or that supports us, and I know exactly what they have access to at all times. So that's a zero defect model, and that's what we mean. And so your access controls, both inside and outside, must be 100% accurate. And the way you do this is through identity, and being prepared to leverage this concept, right, based on identity, and this goes back to looking at your cybersecurity program through that lens of identity, is what the zero defect model means. Not zero trust, that's a whole other topic, and I'm sure there's some folks here maybe talking about zero trust, but building towards a zero defect model. And so how do we got a battle plan. Obviously, the objective is to win the war. So how do we do that? So in addition to applying a zero defect model or basing our controls around that idea, so if you don't effectively manage identity, whether it's on-prem, and we know if you don't do it well on-prem, you're not going to do it well in the cloud, every other dollar you spend in your security program is sub-optimized. And again, if you go back to that sort of NASCAR logo slide of all those vendors, and we were falling victim to the shiny object syndrome and just going out and acquiring those tools, not properly integrating them, not integrating them based on identity or using identity contextually, then again, those dollars that we spend will be sub-optimized. So go back one quick second. Thank you. So there are no outsiders, right? Outsiders, excuse me. You've entered into a relationship with a user. Being in that relationship makes them an insider, right? And going back to this Maginot line, the French didn't really understand, I don't think, and I'm not a complete World War II history buff, but I don't think they understood the relationship with the Belgians. Otherwise, they may have further secured or extended the Maginot line to protect that path or that channel as a means of compromise. But the idea is very simple, right? There are no outsiders. You've entered into a relationship with a user. Being in that relationship makes them an insider. Just remember that idea. With that, again, the idea is through leveraging identity, some very short, concise steps, knowing what you have, applying a zero defect model. As these walls come down, you will be better prepared to mitigate against breach and other types of cyber attacks. So we've got a few minutes. Are there any questions that anyone has? Questions, comments? Does anybody think I'm sort of, this idea doesn't make sense, can't resonate, can't work, we can't be ready? This is not something we can apply in our environment for any reason. Then you're all in agreement, 100% agreement. Fantastic. That's beautiful. So we'll all then apply some of these measures, and again be ready when those walls have come down, right? They have essentially disappeared. Yes, Curtis. Yeah, so guys, if you didn't hear the question was, would you apply this or attack this through technology or looking at it more programmatically? I think, and falling victim to shiny object syndrome, I don't think that's the answer, right? We've spent billions of dollars, right, on cybersecurity products, yet we're still getting breached. So I think we do need to take a step back, understand the program, right? What does the program look like? What is our roadmap? How do we take the tools that we have, understanding what we have, and potentially there's an opportunity to integrate some of those solutions. Maybe we can enrich the analytics that we're getting and have more visibility. Again, applying identity in a contextual way, and building that, the blueprint that I showed, the identity-defined security blueprint. So looking at identity, identity-centric security, and applying those measures. So I wouldn't just go out and, buy another box and throw it in your data center or in the cloud or what have you. I think certainly taking a step back, understanding what you have, understanding what your program looks like, what are the gaps, closing those gaps, and then moving forward with, hey, yeah, I may need some new technology, but at least applying it or looking at it from a use case and a requirements approach will make sure that what you're buying next really works and will be sufficient to close the gaps that you do have. Thanks for the question. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I think I missed the beginning part of the presentation.
Yeah.
And the analogy about border between France and Belgium.
Yes.
And Belgium, I'm not real clear on history. They were allies to France, but Germany was not.
Yeah. So the border was actually, the Maginot Line was a fortress. It was a fortification built between France and Germany. So the French were afraid that the Germans were going to invade again. This is pre-World War II. So they built this fortitude, right? And they didn't extend the line to the French-Belgian border. And that's with the Blitzkrieg, which you may know that terminology, and planes and tanks and other things, the Germans were easily compromised and got around that Maginot Line. So it was a massive investment that didn't really, partially, and attacked other parts. So they came in through Belgium and attacked other parts of the wall that they knew were weaker. So that's how they were able to compromise it. And another wall that sort of came down was the Great Wall of China, right? Genghis Khan was able to invade through over that wall. So the kind of point there was, these walls are coming down, but we need to be ready when they do. If that makes sense. Yeah.
As you prepare for this readiness, right, how important is an IAM steering committee, and what sort of individuals should be on that sort of steering committee in order to prepare?
Well, definitely I think a steering committee, and generally speaking, I can't apply this to every single organization because they're all different sizes and cultures and there's all kinds of politics. But yes, I would say there should be some kind of steering committee or some kind of guiding group within the organization that sets goals, sets objectives for the IAM program, and then measures those and tracks those and figures out where things need to go. we all know identity touches, well, maybe we don't all know, right? But identity touches so many different stakeholders. So representation from, you know, if you're regulated or heavily regulated, representation from legal, compliance, other groups, right? You know, I met with an organization a couple weeks ago. They want to be 90% in the cloud by 2020. So certainly whoever is driving that, the CIO, CTO, cloud architect, they need to be part of that committee. HR, other departments and functions, because identity does touch so much. Now, they don't necessarily need to be involved on every single meeting, but certainly maybe quarterly. And there's likely a core team that is handling the bulk of the the work from a steering committee perspective. And then a larger team gets together, you know, more infrequently to figure out where things are and where things are headed. Cool. I got to wrap up because we do have another presentation, but thank you guys for your attention.